Segment 3, Gold and Black Live, joined by, I always kid Dick Satterfield because he was really the original 15 in basketball, kind of. and then they had a guy named Zach Eady. There have been some other 15s at Purdue too, but Dick Satterfield joins us. And Mike Steele. I don't know if there's – Mike Steele's an original as it is. They haven't had that many 41s over the years. John Kitchell's one that comes to mind. Jim Rowinski, right? Jim Rowinski was number 41.
Yeah.
So I guess so Mike might not be the top number 41 of all time. I don't know. But
I told the grandkids when I brought them the game, I said 41, it's in the rafters, and the 10-year-old said, Pop, that says women.
yeah. There you go.
So I tried.
We are going to pay homage to a dear friend of all of ours, and Frank Kendrick, of course, who passed in December, and a Purdue basketball legend in a number of different ways, and certainly on the basketball court and as an assistant coach, and a character in many different ways. These guys knew him well because they were teammates of Frank's on the 1974 NIT championship team. Both Dick and Mike played very important roles in those games. Mike was big in the garden. He's one of those guys when the lights come on. Mike Steele showed up. And Dick Satterfield, I'm not going to mention his game against Iowa, but he did a lot of really good things for that basketball. And he was a charter member of the Soul Patrol the next year. You can Google that of what that was. I don't know if that's a politically incorrect term. It really isn't anymore. But Dick Satterfield, guys that have been very attached to Purdue men's basketball for a period of time. Dick, I'm going to start with you. Frank, bigger than life character. I think I wrote in the story he was full of it sometimes, which he was, but he also was a terrific basketball player. And there's one thing that seemed to be a common denominator that you two share too. He loved Purdue. He went through a trial separation for a while. We'll hit that subject as well, but really unique character. And we miss Frank, and there never has quite been one quite like him in a lot of ways. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The first time I ever saw Frank, I'd read about Frank being from Hagerstown. You read about him in Indianapolis Star, really good player from Tech. And he was a year behind McGinnis and Downing. So anyhow, I'd heard about Frank, and I remember I was a junior in high school, and Richmond had beaten us in the first game of the sectionals. And I was over there on a Saturday afternoon watching more sectional games, and into the gym comes a guy named Frank Kendrick, and he was holding court as a senior in high school. The thing I remember the most about him was he had a purse, which he continued to carry at Purdue. But he was a wonderful guy, and one of the things that I appreciated so much about Frank was how well he treated me. I was a nobody on that team, and he treated me like I was a somebody. And I will miss him deeply, and I'm forever thankful to Coach Painter for getting him back into the family after, as you called it, Alan, a trial separation.
Yeah, I think that's it. He's the first person I ever saw with a purse, and the first person I think I ever saw or with a car phone.
Well,
it was like a phone that sat on his armrest, and I don't know how it worked.
It didn't. Steely will tell you too. It didn't work, but it looked like a car phone, but it didn't work.
There you go. That would be Frank. Mike, your thought, your initial. Obviously the passing is a difficult thing, and yet he was been a staple of Purdue basketball for a very, very long time.
Every time I'd go to a game, and you'd see Frank, he truly would make you feel like you were the most important person in the stadium, in the arena. That was just Frank. And before I do get into Frank, though, I'm going to tell you what Sat really contributed when he was at Purdue was his GPA.
Yes, he did.
I think they kept him on the team his freshman year because his GPA was like having two smart people. And then he almost blew it because I think he had 1 B his whole career there. And I think I had 2, but most of mine were C's and D's. His were all A's. And so anyway, but back to Frank, the phone. What happens? Frank didn't pay his phone bill, and so it was turned off, and so he unplugged it from his apartment and acted like he had a car phone.
Ah.
So that girls would say, "Hey, you got a car phone," and then the rest is history. Yeah, so that's, and then remember when we went to New York and like the only people that were dressed exactly the same were Clyde Frazier and Frank Kendrick.
Frank Kendrick, yep.
They had the fake mink coats. I mean, Frank's was fake. Clyde probably his was real, I'm sure, but no, to Sat's point, and when I was on the freshman team, because they had him back then, Frank was always nice. He was always nice to me, but I didn't really know him. But my sophomore year, he was great with everybody. But I think the first time I got in a game and I made a cut and I was wide open and Frank didn't throw it to me, he shot it. And we came down the floor. He said, "Steely, my bad. I'll get you next time." Well, after the season, I said, "Frank, you're not here anymore. When are you going to pass it the next time? Because you missed me the last 25 games." Oh, yeah. But he would tell you that soaking, what he said. He'd look you right in the eye and go, "Steely, my bad. My bad. I'll get you next time." Yeah. But, man, he could score.
Yeah. He was, I don't think people realize what a great player he was.
Yeah.
He could score on the baseline. He could spin on the baseline. He could rebound. I mean, we had some really good players, but Frank was the best player his senior year for sure.
Yeah, and he had a good – Fred Schaus was a perfect coach for him too, because he coming from the NBA, he let Frank be Frank. He'd shoot some bad shots, but I mean – he could run stuff for Frank and get him open, and all you had to do was get him the ball with just a little bit of daylight, and something good would happen.
Yeah, I think one thing about when your teams ran the court extremely well. I mean, that was and you had other guys that could fill the bill from that standpoint, but Frank fit that well. I mean, he could get that rebound and get it out and go, and that was one thing that he seemed to me to make him unique. Like you said, Mike, with Fred Schaus's offense and the way you guys played, you guys could score with the best of them.
Yeah, it fit right in. And then we had other guys that could shoot it. And then we had Park, who, you know how good Park was, and he was unselfish. And I think that, I think that's one of the things that Braden Smith is so good at. We just got to start, as we talked earlier before we just got to start making some shots. But anyway, we'll get into that later. But Frank and Frank, that my sophomore year when we won the NIT, Frank, that whole year was a great teammate. I mean, he was he was great and treated us all. We had a great group of guys that year because everybody respected each other and hung out together. It was a great season.
Dick, the conduit to Frank, and at least in my life, was Bob King, and because Bob had so much to do with probably so much to do with his recruitment. And Frank came to Purdue and was not academically eligible his freshman year, and had to sit out as what I think they called non-predictors in those days. But came in and worked his way into being, he had to mature a fair amount. I think it's a fair way to say it, from his sophomore to junior to senior years. But talk about the connection. We've all talked about Bob King and the role of that, but that Indianapolis, getting a guy from Tech, of course, Bob coached at Shortridge. He knew everybody down there, but getting Frank was a big deal at that time, just because, like I said, on the heels of McGinnis and Downing, there was a lot of talent in the city of Indianapolis around that time.
Yeah, and Steely and I, we love Coach Bob, and that's we could have a whole show on Coach Bob, but Frank and Coach Bob were similar, and they both treated you like you were the most important thing going. I mean, I wasn't important at all. Steely was a little bit more important than I was, but at the end of the day, neither one of us are very important, but Coach Bob treated us like we were. But Frank loved Coach Bob, and one of the things that's not talked about enough, but Frank graduated from Purdue, and he worked hard to graduate from Purdue.
Yes, he did.
And I would say that in some ways, Frank would tell you the thing he's proudest of in his life might have been that degree from Purdue. And he worked hard. I'm sure Coach Bob must have really worked hard, right, Steely?
Yeah. I know. Coach Bob, you think about it, we didn't have computers, we didn't have study hall, we didn't have any of that stuff. It was just Coach Bob had his people on campus. You'd miss a class, and by the time you got to practice, you'd have a note on your locker room. See me's, CB. I'm like, oh, geez, how do you find out? Yeah.
No, I remember, and I think it was like paying tribute to his mother too. Just the fact that how much that meant to his family that he had graduated and did it. I think he did it on time. He did it. I think he graduated in '74, and that was very, very impressive. I do want to go back to this because Frank's disdain for IU. Now that again during his trial separation changed a little bit, but you guys had one of the most difficult games that I can recall in Bloomington. Frank's senior year, your last game was the last game of that season, and you could have snuck your way to the playoffs. It ended up Michigan and Indiana play in the playoffs in the '74 to make the one spot in the NCAA tournament, but. Just some memories from that '74 season and what Frank meant. I mean, that game, but of course, another game you lost, but it's certainly a memorable game was North Carolina State and David Thompson. But the game I also thought was a game that changed the season. The home game, that is, of course, against Michigan and Campy Russell. Terrific game and took everything Purdue had. And Jerry Nichols, I think, broke his nose in that game, as I recall. But that was a game that Frank also came up big against some of the best talent in the league, a team that ended up winning the league that year. But just your overall memories of that '74 season and Frank's role in that. Dick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I remember that. It's interesting you say that about Michigan and North Carolina State because we had North Carolina State beat. And they came back and beat us in the second half. And they won the national championship that year. Right. And I'm not saying we would have won the national championship, but we could have won the national championship. We were really a good team. Frank, people forget, but his junior year, he had a game winner up
at Michigan, right?
And we won that game. And I thought Campy Russell, I'll be interested to see what Mike says. I personally thought he was the best player we played against. And we played against some really good players. We played against, of course, David Thompson, played against Marvin Barnes. We played against Tom Henderson. We played against a ton of good players. But Frank he had a will to win. The other game, Alan, you didn't mention, and I wouldn't expect you to because we won. But I'll never forget we were playing at Ohio State, and we were tied with 2 seconds to go, and Ohio State had a 1-and-1.
Yeah.
The guy missed the free throw. Frank got the rebound. They fouled him. He hit the shot. So we started off, I think, 6-0 or something in the Big Ten, and it was a tough league back then. But, yeah, Frank, he had a real will to win. And between him and Garrett, we had a lot of places we could go to get points.
Yeah. How about that Indiana thing, Steele? Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was back when the Big Ten had, ironically, like what you might call 10 teams.
I know. Crazy.
And before I get into Frank playing that year, but I was just thinking, Frank, he got in trouble as assistant coach for either taking somebody to the airport at the wrong time or putting somebody, whatever it was. He would have been stellar right now when there's no rules.
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want. Whenever you want, and Frank never met a stranger, and I'd have hired him in a second, especially nowadays. I mean, he was, and nobody could express their love for Purdue any better than Frank Kendrick could.
Yeah, you go on to his assistant coaching career, 1991 to 1999, and certainly. There was other good coaches on that staff, Bruce Weber certainly, and then some, but in different roles. But Frank had a lot to do with getting a Glenn Robinson to Purdue. Conzo Martin, there was some other circumstances.
I'll tell you a funny story about that. So when Frank was recruiting Glenn, I used to come to some Purdue games, and I'd always noticed Frank was down with Glenn right before the tip-off, and Frank and Glenn were right out under one of the baskets. And I remember I said to Frank one time, I said, "What are you telling Glenn?" He said, "This can all be yours." And Steely said it. I mean, nobody could convince somebody like Frank could. And, Frank got a lot of great players. You know, he got Glenn, he got Conzo. You know, he would have had
Jerron Cornell, Mike Robinson.
Jerron. He would have had Porter Roberts. He would have had Caron Butler. He was coming to Purdue.
Yeah.
You're right, Steele. I can't imagine how good he'd be today with no rules.
No, he'd have been great. He'd have been great.
Yeah. Frank's attention to and again, Purdue had some pretty staunch standards of how they did stuff, and not that Frank was aggressive, and Purdue, I think Gene Cady felt like that was something he needed in recruiting at that time, and was able to do that. And certainly, you know, you mentioned that, and I think that's there were some guys that Purdue was in on at that time and Caron Butler being one, and I'm drawing a complete blank of the center at Wisconsin that Purdue had.
Yeah, Rashard Griffith.
Rashard Griffith, and that was that might have been the missing piece to the '94 team winning the whole shooting match. With all due respect to Brandon Brantley and others, but this was that was the deal. Talk about that too, guys. And you've been around long enough with guys like Brandon Brantley, Conzo Martin, others that talk about just that allegiance to Frank. I mean, obviously they was recruited to him, and Frank, after leaving Purdue, you know, the NCAA investigation and all that, and you can debate what it wasn't the world's most serious infractions, but it was enough to and at the end of the day end his career, at least at Purdue. But that allegiance to him in terms of what he brought from a recruiting standpoint, but also how difficult that was, not only for the Purdue, you know, you got people right now that even 25 years later that talk about exactly what you said, and that is that Frank made you feel important, and Purdue fans have a lot of allegiance to what he brought to the table, not only from that time, but also when he left after 1999, it was hard. So, Mike, I'll start with you just in terms of that. And I don't know how much I know you stayed in touch with him, but that was a hard time for him being away from Purdue, and hard time for Purdue as well.
No, he never really, to me, never blasted Purdue. I think he just knew that he'd made a mistake or a couple mistakes, whatever, but he didn't think they were huge mistakes. And in retrospect, they weren't.
No,
but
they weren't.
That was a different time. But to his credit and to Purdue's credit, because I know that Dick mentioned Matt, but I think he was really the deciding guy that said, "Hey, we got to get Frank Kendrick back in the family," and and he did. And so that's because it was a tough time for Frank.
Yeah.
So Alan and Mike, I'll tell you a story that Ann and I, my wife Ann, we went to visit Mika and Christoph, Melanie, and Emil the Saturday. He passed away on a Thursday. We were in Florida. We were flying back, and I thought for sure we were going to get there in time. But Matt had called me on Wednesday, and this just shows the kind of guy Matt Painter is. Matt and Brandon were down there visiting him on the Wednesday, the day before he died. But I found out later from Christoph, and I thought this says so much about Trey Kaufman-Renn. He came down and visited Frank on Sunday because Frank had an impact on Trey deciding to go to Purdue. And it's like what you said, Steely. I mean, all these years later, Frank is still recruiting for Purdue. And I think Trey would tell you that's one of the reasons he went to Purdue was because of Frank.
Yeah, no doubt. He was involved, in his son, Christoph, very involved in the AAU world. But Frank was involved, so much talent down in Indianapolis. And of course, Trey was from Scottsburg, right? But or is from Scottsburg, but Southern Indiana. But a huge factor in terms of that. No question, his legacy is not only his playing days, his coaching days, but really, like you said, and his return. And Matt Painter had everything to do with that. And to his credit, that's why they have that great culture there from that standpoint. All right, final thoughts, guys. Mike, I'll start with you. Just anything else that you didn't get to say here about Frank that you'd like to add to the fray?
No, I just. He just made me smile every time I saw him. Like I might not see him for a year, and as soon as I'd see him, I'd kind of go up behind me, and then he'd always say, "Steely, man, you look great, man. If you'd have waited, I go, no, Frank, I'm fat. I don't look great, but no, and he he cared about, whenever you'd see Frank, he'd ask about all the guys we played with. He'd say, have you talked to Park? Have you talked to Sat? I mean, that was just his, that was his personality. And I truly believe that anybody that he played with, if he really needed something and needed some help, Frank would have been right there to help.
Yeah, no question. Dick, your final thoughts?
Yeah, my only thoughts are he was a great player. He was a great coach, but he most of all, I was so proud of Frank for the husband he became and the father. Just a tremendous person, and he leaves behind a great family, Purdue family, and we got to make sure that we support Mika and the kids because they were a true family that Frank oversaw, and he did a great job.
Yeah, it's intensely loyal. Their kids are to him. He was obviously intensely loyal to Frank, but from all the kids, and I knew 2 or 3 of them better than others, but it is just a tribute to him in terms of that. And Mika is up for sainthood. We know that from that standpoint, but that's a whole nother show we can get into. But Frank, there's nobody quite like Frank, and I do think that's Matt Painter's going to have a long legacy at Purdue when his days are done. But one of the most important things he did is kept the Purdue basketball family intact. And like you said about Frank, on a personal note, that was back when we could have players over at houses and for dinner, and Frank would treat the Karpik family like we were important as well. Even I was 13 years old, and he'd bring a person, so we thought that was cool. So never anybody like Frank. So guys, thanks so much. We will have another discussion about that team that's playing on the court. Purdue basketball, of course, played last night against Minnesota and have a big game Sunday. Every game is going to be tough in the Big Ten this year for Purdue as the Boilermakers take on Northwestern on Sunday. All right, guys, thanks again. I want to thank Triple X and State Farm agent Trent Johnson and the good folks at WLFI for making this happen. We appreciate that too. And we'll stay tuned next week. We'll have another show for Golden Black Live, and have a great rest of your January weekend, and Happy New Year to everybody. And we'll talk again soon.
Alan, thanks, man.